these individuals were the ones that were preaching to us ad nauseum about patriotism, about the Queen, about having the British flag, while at the same time they were having parties the night before Prince Philip's funeral. So while the Queen sat on her own and the nation more widely was in a state of national mourning, these people were having parties week in, week out, including 2 late night parties the night before the funeral. How disgraceful and shameful does somebody have to be in order to do that? Oh, I tell you what, he should have resigned a long, long time ago. The Partygate scandal is just the latest litany of his constant, just whether it's minor misdemeanors to also outright abuse of the rules. It cannot be one rule for him and his elitist chums, another one for the rest of us plebs. I've never experienced anything like that ever. Zarlush, I'm telling you, is that we had, I think, more than 1,000 emails on one day, and that's emails people actually felt the need to write a letter or an email, let alone what was going on social media, the hundreds of millions of views, and the thing, it was off the scale. I'd never experienced anything like that. And when experienced parliamentarians like the then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, he came up to me and he put his hand on my shoulders and he said, "You know what, Tan, I've been here for almost 40 odd years, and that's the best PMQ I've ever seen. Well done, amazing."
Hi Tan, it's a pleasure to have you today with us at New Politic. To give a little background to our viewers, you were elected as a Member of Parliament for Slough in 2017 and continue to be the first British and European MP to wear a turban. You were promoted to Shadow Railway Minister in April 2020, and that's a role that you've retained since the December 2021 reshuffle. Today's interview will be a chance to get to know more about you and your views on British politics, race and empire. So thank you for agreeing to do the interview with us today.
Absolute pleasure, Zeyd. Thank you to yourself and Zarlush for coming here to Parliament, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion for your New Politic platform.
Thanks very much, Tan. So to get us started, first we'll be talking a little bit about the Labour Party. You previously mentioned, and famously, I quote, "If we do not stand for the rights of others, then what exactly are we doing in media and politics?" What do you think Labour needs to do in order to live up to this philosophy?
Well, look, it is very important that we do stand for something, and in terms of the Labour Party, why the likes of myself joined, why my grandfather, who was a committed socialist, a teacher, why him, my parents and others were drawn to the Labour Party, is that it stands for equality, it stands for a fairer, a more just society. So we constantly need to be taking steps towards that. Labour has always traditionally been the anti-racist party, fighting for women's rights, fighting for the rights of the LGBT plus community, people with disabilities. You see through our history, and throughout that history, it has always been a more inclusive approach to how we have a society. So I hope that we will carry on in that fine tradition.
You've also spoken about Indian farmers' protests, what's been happening in Kashmir and minority rights in other countries. So why do you think it's important for MPs to speak about international issues, even though Britain has a lot of its own domestic problems?
One of the real pleasures of being a British parliamentarian is that you end up discussing on one occasion it might be something to do with my Slough constituency, very local, very parochial issues, or the next minute it might be about national issues or about the environment, something that's happening within our country, and within an hour of that you're discussing international affairs. And I think that it actually leads to better parliamentarians, people who have researched, who have honed their skills in different aspects of polity, whether it's local, national or international. So that is a fine tradition of British democracy, and I think that we should be very proud of that. We shouldn't just concentrate on what's happening in our area or in our region. We have got allies, we've got friends, and unfortunately foes around the world as well. So we need to be completely up to date with what's going on around that. And then have discussions and debates. And there are also times when us as British parliamentarians, when we say something, that is listened to by especially our friends. Sometimes we may offer constructive criticism, sometimes we may offer compliments and plaudits for what they're doing, but whether it's in terms of international development, so foreign aid issues, you'll see these issues constantly being debated, because not only do we need to eradicate poverty here locally, but we also need to eradicate poverty and move towards a more just society internationally.
We 100% agree with you, and we would be interested to know if you've ever experienced pushback against raising those issues in your own career, or if you know of others who have experienced pushback.
Definitely, Zarlush. I've got my fair cohort of trolls, so constantly on the case. Somebody saying, "Keep your nose out of my country's affairs. Keep your nose out of my country's affairs."
Right.
Deal with just Slough issues. If you're dealing with Slough issues, then people say, "Why aren't you dealing with national issues?"
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about national stuff, then they say, "Why aren't you talking about international issues?" So there's no pleasing everybody, but I've got to do what I think is right on a plethora of issues, on a diverse range of issues, whether they're local, national or international, and no amount of trolling is going to stop me from doing that. So you mentioned earlier about the farmers' protests, or whether it's about human rights issues, those need to be discussed, because people need to see that we are standing in solidarity with them. For example, the recent farmers' protests, many of us were impacted. My parents, they actually tilled the land, so they were farmers before they emigrated here. So that hit us personally as well. And when the likes of myself and many of my Slough constituents, more than 3,000 signed a petition, an official parliamentary petition, by the way, when we saw the brute force or tear gas or water cannon being used against them, that pains people, not just in that particular nation, but the diaspora around as well, and also fair-minded people. You don't need to be a farmer, you don't need to emanate from that particular country or that region in order to feel that pain. So we often stand in solidarity with others. A classic example is the BLM movement. We were there standing in solidarity with black people around the world, because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just African Americans that felt that pain of George Floyd. Many of us felt that, and that's why sometimes something emanating in one particular region or a country, it can have a truly global impact.
The pandemic in particular has shown that key workers are actually critical in a time of crisis. So some of the media narrative has been that bankers, lawyers, people earning lots of money are the ones that are keeping society going. But I think that narrative has somewhat been uprooted during the pandemic. From workers, delivery drivers to shopkeepers who have been, keeping the economy literally going. And you've previously spoken about the importance of well-funded public services. And as you know, the Conservatives responded by clapping on their doorsteps every Thursday for key workers. What should the Labour government do to acknowledge their sacrifices?
You're 100% correct, because it's not just enough to clap for people. That gesture politics, which the Conservatives find so easy, that's all fine and dandy, but it's got to be translated into actions. So we saw, as you rightly said, during the pandemic, it was the key workers, whether it was our doctors and nurses, the delivery drivers, people working with an interface with the public, who, in the midst of a pandemic, and let's face it, many of us didn't actually know the extent of what we were facing, just how dangerous or deadly this virus was. And during that, they risked their life in order to make sure that the country was moving. So we also owe it to them, in response to your question, is to make sure that they are paid a decent wage. They have those terms and conditions, that we deal with many of those inequalities with regards to pay, the correct terms and conditions, the hours, and many of them are working in insecure work. And that's just not good enough. That whether it's the gig economy, I know more widely, many of the taxi drivers and others, that they were feeling the pinch because they thought that nobody's standing up for them. And their terms and conditions, their wages are way below many of the more affluent sections of our community. But there does need to be a reset so that they also feel valued. Clapping on its own is just not enough.
No, we would agree with you, and we would say that, especially during a crisis like the pandemic, in terms of opposition and government, the roles are particularly challenged and they are different to what they usually do in a normal setting. So taking the leader of opposition, for example, how do you think Keir Starmer has done in opposing the government during the pandemic in those particular difficult circumstances?
Well, Zarlush, I think you've seen that how he's conducted himself is with a lot of sensibility, with being serious, steady, offering opposition, solid opposition as and where is required, but also wherever we need to work in the national interest, we were doing so with the government to make sure that certain measures were put in place in the midst of a national crisis, and that I think is serious leadership. If you juxtapose that next to the way that Boris Johnson has been conducted himself, whether it's the billions wasted in terms of the crony COVID contracts, whether it's the constant lying, the rule breaking, and taking the British public for fools, that I think it's almost like chalk and cheese. And I hope that the wider British public have appreciated that style of leadership, because when we are faced with whether it's a national or international crisis, as we're currently facing with regards to what's going on in Ukraine, then we need serious leadership. We don't want a prime minister who is limping from one day to the next, a weak prime minister who you can't actually believe in because of that lack of credibility and that loss of public trust.
No, we agree with you, and given the level of scandals that have erupted in Number 10 in recent weeks, especially, that almost attests to the challenge of being in government and dealing with all the other domestic and international issues. In your view, would you say that Keir Starmer, as leader of opposition, has struck the right balance in terms of challenging the government and pushing back where it's required, but also working in solidarity in the interests of public safety?
Definitely, Zarlush. I think he has struck the right chord, the right balance, and he has always looked very statesmanlike. The likes of myself can rant and rave. We can get on the case and be very, very forthright on a lot more occasions than he perhaps can be, given that he has to offer that assurance to the wider public as well. But what we want to be doing is, whether it's from the front benches or whether it's from the back benches, is to be holding the actions of the government to account. That is extremely important. That is what I think the great British public would want us to be doing as well. Whether somebody voted for us or not, they can see that we are offering that opposition. But along with that, we have offered a different plan as well. Whether it's to deal with the current cost of living crisis, when we have spiralling energy bills, we have offered up our plan to the government. They haven't taken it up as yet, in terms of getting rid of VAT on fuel bills for the year, whether it's to help our struggling businesses with other initiatives. So all we can do is to be that constructive opposition, but also, as and when it's required, we do need to come together in the national interest.
I just want to focus on one thing that you just mentioned, which was the crony contracts. In November 2020, New Politic revealed that the government, for example, wasted almost $1 billion of taxpayers' money on faulty track and trace contracts, which went to Tory donors, family, friends. I mean, would you call this sleaze, or what would you call it? Some say corruption, some people say sleaze. There's various words for it, but what's your interpretation of these contracts? It's
corruptive practices. It is corruption. In terms of the definition of sleaze, within that, it also mentions corrupt practices. So if you go by definition, there's not a great deal of difference. When you say sleazy contracts, you're meaning that they are corrupt practices, that they are corrupt contracts. And well done also for your investigative work, and you will have known, Zeyd, that figure has now also spiraled out of control. So from 1 billion, the amount of money that's been wasted on test and trace, what was supposed to be a world-beating system, has been a world-beating failure. So much public money, your money, taxpayers' money, has gone towards that. And what have we got to show for it? The test and trace system at one point was actually noted by experts as having only a marginal impact. That was after tens of billions of pounds had been spent on it. If we compare and contrast with some of the Asian nations, their systems were a lot more robust, especially if we look at South Korea, even in China, where the virus actually originated. That shouldn't be the case. We have got the NHS. What I would say is Labour's proudest achievement in office, to have a health service free at the point of need, free at the point of use for everybody, regardless of their ability to pay or not to pay. Now, having that amazing public health system, and having some of the world-leading diagnostic systems as we do have here, we haven't seen that investment from the government. Instead, they have been almost lining the pockets of many of the Tory donors. I've raised this matter in the House on several occasions. There were contracts for PPE, so personal protective equipment contracts. They didn't go to individuals with an expertise in PPE. You had contracts handed out to pest control companies, and there were certain other contracts given out to newly formed companies. It should have gone to highly respected firms and organisations. And also, another egregious thing that came out was more than £250 million went to for a PPE contract, not a specialist, but to a firm specialising in offshore property and financial banking. That's not what should be done. You know, the VIP contracts, and I just hope that public inquiry that they keep kicking into the long grass, that comes very, very quickly, because we need to learn the lessons in order to counter future pandemics, but we also need to hold these individuals who have indulged in corruption, who have damaged the credibility of our country. Those individuals need to be brought to book, and they need to be brought to justice, and the quicker that happens, the better.
Absolutely. And I think it's not a stretch to say that a lack of transparency and a lack of integrity have been a recurring theme of this government for the last 2-3 years. Even now, we take the Partygate scandal, which has been dominating PMQs for the last couple of weeks, and it might prove to be Boris Johnson's downfall after all. Do you think that he can outlive this one?
Oh, I tell you what, he should have resigned a long, long time ago. The Partygate scandal is just the latest litany of his constant, just whether it's minor misdemeanors to also outright abuse of the rules. It cannot be one rule for him and his elitist chums, another one for the rest of us plebs, as I mentioned in the House. Many people couldn't see their dying loved ones. They couldn't be by their bedside. Others could not celebrate birthday parties or special occasions. They had to cancel their weddings because they were trying to do the right thing. They were following government guidance. So for those out there, especially some of these Tory MPs who are either looking for jobs and their ministerial cars, or those that are trying to seek favour, that for them to say that this doesn't matter, people are not bothered about it. Well, I care, as well as millions of others. They also care about these parties, because a Prime Minister holding the highest office in the land, you need to be held to a higher standard. That individual who is setting the rules, and let's not forget what Downing Street, that whole operation, that is where the rules, the guidance was actually being formulated. So they are the ones that should have been following those more than any of the rest of us. And if we look at another fact, is that these individuals were the ones that were preaching to us ad nauseum about patriotism, about the Queen, about having the British flag, while at the same time they were having parties the night before Prince Philip's funeral. So while the Queen sat on her own, and the nation more widely was in a state of national mourning, these people were having parties week in, week out, including 2 late night parties the night before the funeral. How disgraceful and shameful does somebody have to be in order to do that?
Exactly, and we would say that the level of treachery and I think abuse of public trust has resulted in the Tories slumping in their latest polls because of Partygate. Doesn't this show, in your view, that the biggest threat to the Tories are themselves and they're infighting rather than Labour's opposition?
Well, a lot of them have been self-inflicted wounds. from them. The Partygate, nobody was asking him to hold a party. Nobody, or apparently he got ambushed by a cake. But leave that aside. For if we're being serious about things, that if we look at what they've been doing, I think the reason why the public is gradually listening to Labour, we have been on a gradual path, a process to regain people's trust. After our last election defeat, I think that was that really shocked many of us as to how we could arrive at such a defeat in 2019. But it is what it is. Sometimes you just got to dust yourself off and try again. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We have been laying out our policy platform bit by bit. Some of it has been copied and pasted by the Conservatives, which has always been good to see. But what we want to also make people realise is that, one, we will be highlighting their false promises, their broken promises, and their outright lies. But at the same time, we need to have a solid public offering, because if we don't do that, then the British public won't trust us by giving us the reins to power and to say that, look, okay, you serve the country for the next 4 or 5 years.
I think with the whole scandal, Partygate, the Ukrainian contracts, we've seen Boris Johnson's future increasingly come into question, and there have been some reports that Rishi Sunak is tipped to be the next Prime Minister, and if he does achieve that defeat, he'll be the first British Indian Prime Minister of the UK. And in your view, do you think this is or will be a milestone for British society and something Labour should have actually been the first to achieve?
Well, if it happens, obviously it will be a milestone, but in politics you never quite know what is around the next corner. People have been hot favourites before to succeed a Prime Minister. You'll all know about George Osborne, the Chancellor, to David Cameron, the heir apparent. Well, he was nowhere to be seen at the races, as and when the election, the contest for leadership started. So I think there'll be lots of runners and riders. A lot of them are positioning themselves with picture opportunities and with a conveniently positioned flag at one point or another, or perhaps a cake or two. But I think there's a lot to happen before we could ever arrive at that position.
And just on that point, I mean, if, let's say, Rishi Sunak does become Prime Minister, do you think Labour risks losing its image as the party of diversity?
Well, Labour has more women MPs than all of the other parties. It has more ethnic minority MPs than any of the other parties. We have always represented equality and diversity in its various spheres, and I think that will continue because of our values, because of our policies. And just because you have somebody of a particular ethnicity, it doesn't mean that they are acting in the interests of those particular communities. I highlighted that, for example, Zeyd, in the recent Nationality and Borders Bill. When I stood up and to a lot of heckling and barracking from the Tories, but that's because the truth hurts, I actually said, there have been accusations of tokenism from many within Slough and elsewhere within the wider community. What's the point of having a Home Secretary? What's the point of having black and brown cabinet ministers if they are going to act against the interests of those particular communities? That's something that I think the wider public will appreciate. And if we look at the various petitions that are going around in terms of resignations, whether it's for the Home Secretary and others, it's actually been a lot of ethnic minorities themselves, people of Asian heritage, people of Indian heritage, who have been signing that because they do not want their citizenship to be stripped, nor do they want to be treated as second-class citizens. It's no point having, for example, you mentioned earlier, me being the first turban Sikh in the British Parliament or in any European Parliament. There's no point having somebody of Sikh heritage if I am then going to be bringing disrepute and dishonour to that particular community. I need to be making sure that I'm working for the interests of the people of Slough, for the interests of the Sikh community, for the interests of the British community, because that is what I have been sent here to do. So that is why the accusations of tokenism are so prevalent, and you'll know that just from a mere glance at social media and the various memes that are going around. So just because somebody looks like they may solve all of our ills, doesn't mean that they will.
I think your point touching upon the importance of substance over slogans or tokenism or superficial, I guess, loyalties to a particular race or ethnic minority even holds true if we look at Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Your famous speech during the Prime Minister's questions where you called out Boris Johnson, his racist and Islamophobic remarks went viral on the media. What was the thought process behind making that speech, and what was your reaction when it went viral?
Well, as a reaction, I'll tell you what, I've never experienced anything like that, ever. Zarlush, I'm telling you is that we had, I think, more than 1,000 emails on one day, and that's emails people actually felt the need to write a letter or an email, let alone what was going on social media, the hundreds of millions of views, and the thing, it was off the scale. I'd never experienced anything like that. And when experienced parliamentarians like the then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, he came up to me and he put his hand on my shoulders and he said, "You know what, Tan, I've been here for almost 40 odd years, and that's the best PMQ I've ever seen. Well done, amazing." And then their social media team informed me afterwards that it was the most shared video that they've ever had on that platform that they've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, in terms of a reaction, that it was very satisfying, because I stood up for what I believed in at your very first question. And that resonated with many within the wider community. And I think in terms of to answer your first part of your question, what drove me to do that, I think it was where the likes of myself, I'm a vice chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims. You don't need to be a Muslim to be a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, just as you don't need to be a Sikh to be a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs. But during that, many of us, on a cross-party basis, had been calling on Theresa May to bring to heel her backbencher, or as he was then the Foreign Secretary prior to that as well, for his derogatory and demeaning remarks. And I also had various constituents and others who had felt that pain, because after his racist remarks, and there's no other way of going about it, regardless of what he might be terming it as some sort of libertarian argument, etc. Well, look, that led to a spike in hate crime. There was a 375% spike in hate crime. Many already vulnerable Muslim women had tomatoes, eggs thrown at them. And I know what it feels like when you look different to the wider population. Having brightly coloured turbans, that as I might have joked to the speaker, that look, I hope that acts as a beacon for you to constantly refer to the Honourable Member for Slough to make his invaluable contributions. But conversely, when you know that more than 99% of the community looks different, they're not wearing a turban, and when you face racism at school or elsewhere, there was a very sickening episode during my secondary school when one of my so-called classmates thought it'd be really funny if you try to pull off my turban, and that does have a devastating impact on you at that particular point in time. So what I drew upon was my own personal experiences, and I also wanted to show solidarity with those women, to say that, look, don't worry, some of us will be holding this person to account. It doesn't matter whether he's the most powerful person in the land. Some of us will be able to very, very forthrightly put those questions. But the real sad travesty in all of this is that, one, there wasn't an apology forthcoming. He started to talk about his relatives and his mates and others. Well, look, we don't want to know about your friends and relatives who may be Sikh or Muslim or others. What we wanted to hear from the Prime Minister was an apology, a formal apology from the dispatch box for his hurtful and demeaning commentary. And by the way, that never came, neither then. I think in the heat of the election he did give a mealy-mouthed apology, and only when prodded to do so. But secondly, I asked for an independent inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. There had been an increased prevalence of those incidents within the Conservative Party, so they owed it to the nation, and he had promised that on national television, along with his then Chancellor Sajid Javid. So if they had promised that, surely they needed to then deliver on that independent inquiry into Islamophobia. And to this day, they have not done so. And that also refers, let me refer that, Zeyd, to your earlier point about having an ethnic minority prime minister or cabinet ministers. Well, what use was a Muslim cabinet minister who had promised that independent inquiry, and then it took a Sikh person or it took other parliamentarians to be asking for that? Surely he, sitting around the cabinet next to Boris Johnson, being the second most powerful person in the nation at that time before he resigned, he should have been saying, look, we have promised, the two of us have promised it, so maybe we need to come good on our promise. So that, I think, also illustrates that just because somebody looks a particular way doesn't mean that they will act in the interests of that particular community.
And shockingly, Islamophobia is still an ongoing issue in the Conservative Party to this day, with new revelations, on a timely basis. So I think the passion that was in your speech really resonated with people with the same religion, or people who could relate to previously, being victims of similar racist or Islamophobic remarks. And I think there's something particularly damaging about that coming from our highest office. And like you said, essentially being able to get away with it without any real consequences. On the issue of representation and race in general, growing up, you spent around 5 years in the Punjab, and you're proficient in Urdu, Punjabi, and Hindi. Even if you say you're the best at Punjabi out of those three, which helps you speak to your constituents and break down those barriers. You're also fluent in 5 other languages. What do you think about the argument that if you're in England, then all non-English speakers should learn to speak English?
Well, first of all, may I say, learning a language is an asset. I would encourage all of your viewers to be doing that as well, because it helps to break down barriers. You also learn so much about a different culture, a different way of doing things. And even if you speak in broken forms of that particular language. So I went over to France and made a 10-minute speech in French. It may not have been the most polished French that those French people would have heard, but it changed their perspective on me as a person, because I look different, and I don't think they would have been seen or heard from too many turbaned individuals, people who had come over from England. They probably thought that they could probably just about speak in English, but to be able to speak in French, that changed their attitude towards me, towards a town twinning, and I think it brought us closer together. So that's the beauty of language. And yes, within my constituency, that ability to speak in Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, for example, when I go to local mosques or the Gurdwaras or the Hindu temple, that is brilliant, because you can bridge the generational divide. To answer the second part of the question, whether learning English is something that we should be doing, I think we should be encouraging the learning of English, but we also need to acknowledge that some people who have been here for decades, many people can't read and write either, and that, by the way, is true of whether it's English speakers as well as speakers of other languages. There are many within our communities, our diverse communities, who do not have as good a grasp of literacy or English. But I think in terms of the national language, in terms of increasing communication, that's definitely something that we should be encouraging, while at the same time we should not be denigrating the learning of other languages. If the Swiss can do it, they can speak in various languages. It doesn't deter them from being fluent in their particular mother tongue or their particular regional tongue. So it can be done, and I'm very proud of my ancestral heritage. You mentioned about the Punjab, so being able to go there, speak in Punjabi, I think is brilliant, and I think that is also something that I would like to think that would endear me to them. They'd think that yes, this person can relate to us. He can appreciate what we're going through, and there's certain things that you can say in particular languages, and the tone and the mannerisms that you can't get with translations. As much as we would like to get certain phrases in Hindi or Urdu translated into Punjabi or translated into English, you just can't get the essence or the flavour of what is being said. Sometimes the different layers of what you're saying. So you're saying one thing, but it could have a double or a triple meaning. I think that I would strongly encourage everybody to learn languages. It's an excellent skill to have.
I think this discussion about learning various languages goes to the nature of our globalised world today. But this idea of globalisation isn't new. For example, the British Empire, which was the largest empire that's ever existed, was obviously in various areas of the world. And New Politic recently launched Project Empire, which is an editorial series designed to explore this very history. And in recent sort of years, we've seen narratives of empire come back into the mainstream. With, for example, the Confederate flag. We've seen it with, obviously, Black Lives Matter, as you mentioned. Do you think there should be more discussion about the British Empire and its contemporary impact in schools and parliament and its sort of legacy in modern Britain?
Definitely, Zeyd. Well done, first of all, for your initiatives. That is, and that series. Yes, we within the Labour Party, we have called for that emancipation educational trust, whereby we wanted that discussion and that inclusion within our curriculum of the teaching of what has happened in our diverse history, and including empire, to learn the lessons from that. I think history needs to be warts and all. We can't certainly preclude certain things, because if we are to learn the lessons from history, then we need to be having frank and honest discussions. And as a student of history, my MPhil was actually in South Asian history and its connections with Great Britain. So I studied about empire as well, colonial as well as post-colonial era. And I think that had a massive impact on me, and I think it would have on many of our young people as well. It would help us as a nation to become more integrated, that community cohesion, because many of us would have been able to appreciate what has actually happened in our shared past. Look, what happened, what our ancestors may or may not have done, doesn't bear on what the decisions of a current government of the day or the opposition of the day or us as individuals. That's happened in the past, but we need to learn the lessons, and we can't do that by ignoring it.
I think we saw this notion and narrative of empire come to a head in Britain with the Colston Four, who toppled Edward Colston's statue. Of course, they were recently acquitted, but do you think statues to former slave traders or imperialists deserve to be protected?
Well, I personally don't think that whether it's slave traders or others should be put on a pedestal to be revered and looked up to. I think that should be reserved for those individuals in our history who have done incredible things for the country and perhaps indeed for the wider world. And those are the people that we need to be memorializing, whether it's those that have made the ultimate sacrifice. For example, I'm the president of the National Sikh War Memorial Campaign. We're trying to get a statue of turbaned Sikh soldiers, because that, I think, will also lead to greater integration. It would be a living history lesson for our future generations as well as the present generations, because they can see that people who look different to them have made the ultimate sacrifice, because tens of thousands were killed and more than 100,000 were injured during just the First and Second World War. And when we talk about the Punjab recently, there have been other discoveries recently, but that the undivided India, the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh together, the undivided India, that was the largest volunteer army in history. Some of their contributions, the contribution of our Commonwealth soldiers, those in particular from Africa and the Caribbean, that's just not as widely acknowledged and appreciated, and we need to speak up on those particular issues. With regards to Colston also, I think the local communities there in Bristol had been trying for years through the correct procedures, through petitions, through going to the local council to say it's not right that we are celebrating a slave trader, and I agree with them that the rightful place for that statue is in a museum with an inscription, so that we can discuss and debate the pros and cons of what that individual did. A lot of that money may have helped to build up that city, but We need to see where did that money originate from. How many people were killed or massacred? How many people were thrown overboard by that repulsive slave trade, and that individual was involved in that trading? So that's the conversation that I think that we need to be having in order to move forward as a society.
Touching on your points about tracing the money and the various atrocities that have happened in South Asia and abroad, well, you know, it's not a shared secret that Britain's colonial legacy has been littered with various atrocities. If we take partition to Thatcher's influence over the Amritsar attack on the Sikh Golden Temple, which you've also previously spoken about, in your view, is compensation the only way Britain can reconcile with its colonial legacy?
Well, that's something that we need to make sure that individuals who have done something wrong actually come out and issue that formal apology. You mentioned about the massacre, the 1919 massacre of Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, where people were killed cold. That was cold-blooded murder. And that there has never been a formal apology from a Prime Minister, and that is what those communities in both India and Pakistan, the Punjabi community in particular, that's what they have been demanding. But there have also been other instances whereby, you know, we need to discuss how do we help those communities, whether that's through reparations, whether that's through more investment, more international development aid. There's many ways that we can go about helping to rebuild those nations, because we have a shared history. The UK has a shared history with many other nations around the world, and if the Commonwealth is to mean anything, I think it's that where we have that open discussion, that dialogue, and then we help to make sure that those nations can build a more prosperous future for themselves.
Right, and so in your view, apologies are a powerful way for communities to start healing?
100%. I think if we don't do that, then people can't move on. But that healing process that you've just alluded to, it's important. When somebody in a position of power, especially if it's the most powerful individual, when they stand up and they make an apology on behalf of the nation, that matters. That the government of the day is not responsible. For example, the current Prime Minister is not responsible for the actions of Margaret Thatcher in terms of the advice given by her government towards the storming of the most revered shrine of the Sikhs, the Golden Temple, and that complex. But somebody somewhere needs to make sure that that independent inquiry is held. Forget an apology, we haven't even had an independent inquiry on that. And that's something that the likes of me have been pushing on and will continue to push for.
We're now going to move on to 5 quickfire questions.
Oh, wow.
So please respond to the first thing that comes into your head. So the first question is, let's say Labour wins the general election in 2024. What's the first change that you'd like a Labour government to make?
Well, there are many changes, but in terms of my portfolio, I haven't discussed rail at all. And being the Shadow Rail Minister, I've got to make sure that the first thing that I would hope that we enact is a rolling programme of electrification of our railways. In order to tackle the climate crisis, to decarbonise our transport and our economy, we need to make sure that we catch up, because at the moment only 38% of our railways are electrified, compared with our European counterparts who have managed to electrify the majority of their rail lines, including the Belgians, who are above 80%. So for a nation that pioneered rail to be at 38%, that's absolutely diabolical.
Okay, great. The second question is, you're stuck in a lift for 24 hours. Who do you pick as a companion from the following options? A, Dominic Cummings, B, Priti Patel, or C, Nadine Dorries?
That would have to be Dominic Cummings, because he has been running a masterclass in that drip revelation. So being in a lift with him, I might actually find out more things, more parties and other revelations from him. So I think he would be the most interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, the other two are merely sycophants, I think, of Boris Johnson, so that I don't think would get us anywhere.
It would be the most entertaining lift ride.
Yeah.
The next one, favourite dessert, gulab jamun or Victoria sponge cake?
That's easy, gulab jamun any day of the week.
You wake up tomorrow as David Cameron, what's the first thing that you do?
Text the Prime Minister or text the Chancellor for another contract for one of my mates, because what he's been doing. I'll tell you, he's another person that's brought the august office of Prime Minister into disrepute. I think his reputation's taken a battering. If it had already taken a battering because of what he did in the lead up to the Brexit referendum and how he led the nation in one direction and then had to subsequently immediately resign. But yeah, I think given the sort of person he is, he's probably, that was the first thing that you do is just text, how am I going to make my next buck?
And the last question to bring this interview to an end, summarise your political philosophy in 3 words.
Inclusivity, and I would say equality and integration. Is that bringing people together? I think that is very, very important to me, and that I've done, I think, during my time, whether it's as a decade as an elected councillor, whether it's during the last 5 years as an elected member of Parliament for Slough. What I promised to the people was that I would be bringing them together, that solidarity, that expression of solidarity, as I mentioned earlier with regards to that PMQ that I made to Boris Johnson on his first ever PMQs, is that I think it's important when somebody who might be a man standing up for women, somebody who's a Sikh standing up for people of other faiths, that I think is important, whether it's somebody who is British standing up for people in other parts of the world. That is very, very important to me. So yes, integration is important. I think being inclusive is also very, very important as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Tan. That concludes our interview. It was a pleasure to get to speak to you today, and thanks very much for agreeing to meet with us. And you're a great inspiration for both of us, and I'm sure many more ethnic minorities who aspire to a career in politics.
Well, thank you very much, Zarlush and Zeyd. It's been a real pleasure, and I've very much enjoyed it. It's been with more of a discussion than an interview, and you managed to get me to say a lot more things than I would otherwise have said. I haven't been as guarded, I think, in this interview, but yeah, it's been a pleasure. I do hope that New Politic goes on from strength to strength as well.